All right, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight in support of our ongoing authors series. We're very honored to welcome our special guest, Stephen Prothero, chair of the Boston University Religion Department and author of Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know But Doesn't. Can you name the four Gospels, or a sacred text of Hinduism, or even the holy text of Islam? No, you're not alone, but according to Dr. Prothero, your education is sorely lacking. In a world where, and I quote, religion is the most volatile constituent of culture, and where religion has been, in addition to one of the greatest forces for good in world history, one of the greatest forces for evil. This lack of knowledge is both dangerous and appalling. America, after all, was founded on religious principles, and as a major world power, faces dire consequences when ideologies clash. In his enlightening and provocative new book, Dr. Prothero makes a compelling argument for religion to join reading, writing, and arithmetic as a fourth art taught in classrooms across the land. And with an illuminating historical study, the widely acclaimed Religious Literacy is, to quote Publishers Weekly and Booklist, a must-read. Stephen Prothero, a true credit to the university and the field of religious studies, is the acclaimed and award-winning author of several titles, including the widely praised American Jesus. A doctoral graduate of Harvard, he is one of the country's foremost experts on religion and has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, most recently The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and regularly contributes to the Wall Street Journal. His work has also appeared in the Boston Globe, the New York Times Magazine and Book Review, Salon, and the Washington Post, just to name a few. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Prothero.
Thank you, Jean, for having me. Appreciate it. I've been instructed to stand behind the microphone here. I'm not used to that. I'm kind of a wandering fellow, but I'm going to be dutiful today and stand behind the mic. I'm delighted you're all here. I noticed that Robert Parker, the mystery author, is at the BU Library tonight, and so my first thought was, oh no, mystery writer. I don't write mysteries. Mysteries are more interesting than nonfiction books. And it actually brought me back to a time I was speaking a couple years ago at Stanford. This was shortly after Ken Jennings had ended his run on Jeopardy. And my two daughters were very keen on Ken Jennings, especially my daughter Lucy, my younger girl. And Ken Jennings was the guy who won like 15,000 times in a row on Jeopardy or something. He was on the show for a year. He kept winning. And my daughter really got attached to Ken Jennings. I didn't appreciate this, but when he finally lost, it was quite devastating in my home because we were really following, we were watching every night, and she started to cry, and she ran into her room, and she slammed her door shut, and she was not willing to be consoled. And so when I went to Stanford, that night I noticed, as I was wandering around preparing myself for this lecture, that who was I competing with that night? But I was competing with Ken Jennings. And so I called up my daughter and I said, Lucy, if you were here tonight, your daddy is speaking at Stanford University, and Ken Jennings is speaking too, who would you see? And she, screamed, Ken Jennings! Ken Jennings! So I'm very grateful to all of you for not screaming, Robert Parker tonight. It's really nice. I want to talk about my book, but before I do that, I want to have a contest. I want to have a contest tonight. And for my contest, I need two volunteers. So, and I warn you ahead of time, there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. So do I have a volunteer? Can someone raise their hand? David. Yeah. David, come on up. Come on over here. Who's my other? And but David is. I do know David Lewis, but he's not a plant. Anyone else? Come on, one more. There we go. And what is your name? Jan. You can stand over here next to David. Okay. So we have Jan and we have David. Okay. How many think Jan's going to win? Raise your hand. How many think David's going to win? Raise your hand. Ooh, okay. We'll see about that. All right. No, they're not. That's the point. That was really random. It was very, very random. Okay. Now, as you know, my book is called Religious Literacy, so I'm interested in what we know about religion. So I'm going to find out what people know. So it's Jan, right? Let me start with Jan. Okay, Jan. Who is credited with writing the 5 books of Moses?
I do not know.
Okay, I'm going to say it again. I'm going to say the question a little bit differently. Who is credited with writing the 5 books of Moses?
I just don't believe it's Moses.
Well, it is Moses, and you're exactly right. And for that, you get a star. There you go. Okay. Well done. Okay, David. According to the Hebrew Bible, who almost sacrificed his son?
I think Abraham.
Okay, but that's good. That's the beginning part of the question. But the real question is, how old was Abraham when he died?
180?
No, that's incorrect.
Oh.
I shouldn't have picked David. He's going to be too good at this. It was 175, so you're wrong. I'm sorry. Okay, Jan, here's your question now. The question is, what was Jesus' name?
Joshua?
No. Come on, Jan. Play along. Play along. There we go. Very good. Star. Okay. I really shouldn't have picked you. I'm worried about you.
Okay.
Howard Dean is now chairman of the Democratic National Committee. What is his favorite New Testament book?
Howard Dean.
Yes.
Specifically. It's got to be Revelation.
That's not true.
Oh.
It's not true. His favorite. Does anyone know in the audience? His favorite New Testament book? He was asked. Job. That's right. His favorite New Testament book, he said, was Job. Which is not in the New Testament. Okay. Now, Jan, can you name? How about this? Can you name the 4 Gospels?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Oh my gosh! Excellent. Jan, that's that. There's only 3 questions, by the way, so we already know who the winner is. But I'm gonna. So, David, who is the oldest person in the Hebrew Bible? That's right, but that's just the beginning part. And the second part is, how old was he when he died? How old was he when he died?
Over 175.
That's true, but I need more specific.
In the 900s.
987.
Wow, I'm impressed. 969, but you got it wrong, but it was close. So congratulations, Jan. Okay, so that's my little quiz. Now the real quiz that's in the book is on this sheet, and I'm going to hand this out. Actually, I'm going to ask you guys. Thank you very much. And can I have one, actually, Jean? Oh, and Jean, I have a couple more. And you should start. Well, actually, don't try to answer this now because this will take longer than my entire talk. But what I want to do when these are handed out is just give you an idea of what is going on a little bit with how I got into this book, because one way I got in was by giving students this quiz, and the quiz appears at the back of the book with the answers that are also on the sheet. But I'm often asked, you know what? I don't have enough. I think I only had 40, so maybe you could. What's that? Oh, yeah. If you're holding the book, thank you. It's in the appendix. It's also in the introduction, I think, but it's in the appendix at the very. Okay, there's one extra one. One thing that I noticed as I was teaching, I've been teaching religious studies for maybe 15 years, and I used to assume that my students would know what the 4 Gospels were, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the first book of the Bible, Genesis, or that I could refer to some basic Bible stories as I was talking, or that I could refer to maybe some very simplistic things about Islam or about Judaism. And I gradually realized, and it was gradual, I gradually realized that I really could not do this, that I couldn't make assumptions about what people knew. And so I decided finally to start quizzing them on these basics so I would know what basics they knew, and then I decided to start testing them. And I would refer to these tests as religious literacy tests. And I would say, the purpose of this class is not to memorize names and dates and things about religions, because that's not really that interesting. The purpose of the class is to discuss important beliefs and practices, to compare beliefs and practices across religious traditions, etc. But we can't engage in that interesting conversation unless we have some basic information. It's sort of like having a debate about Major League Baseball without knowing, oh, the Red Sox are a team in Major League Baseball, or the Yankees are a team. I mean, how can you have these discussions unless you have this basic information? So I tried to put together this quiz, which I've given over the last few years to my students. And on the sheet I handed you, I have the quiz written on one side, and then on the other side, I have the results from my last 2 classes of Boston University students. And I should start by saying I give the quiz at the beginning of my classes. It would be too embarrassing to give it at the end of my classes, so I don't do that. Give it at the beginning of my classes. And these are actually religious studies classes, so they're students who are expressing by their choice of being there some interest in the topic. But they're also expressing, because they're intro classes, that they don't feel that they're experts in this area. And so I give them the quiz, and if you turn over to the results on the back, I'm not going to go through all these results, but I just want to talk about a few of them. One thing that I do on the quiz is I give them Bible characters. Yeah, if you look at number 15, I give Bible characters and then Bible stories, and I ask to match. So, for example, you'd want to match Adam and Eve with the Garden of Eden, right? And this turns out to be something that most of my students can do. Almost all my students can match the Adam and Eve with the Garden of Eden. And the same with Moses with parting the Red Sea. But when it comes to the other stories beyond Moses parting the Red Sea and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, I find that there is a kind of, shuffling the deck of these stories among my students where you'll get Paul who's binding Isaac, and you'll get Noah who's leading the exodus of the Israelites out of Babylon, and you'll get Moses getting the olive branch from the dove, and Abraham blinded on the road to Damascus. It's quite confusing. And then Jesus is almost as likely with my students to be born in Nazareth or in Jerusalem as he is to be born, as the Gospels have him in Bethlehem. And this reminded me as I was looking at these quizzes and how my students were doing. And did I say this yet? I don't mean to pick on the BU students, because some of my colleagues have done this at UNC Chapel Hill and also at Wheaton College, which is an evangelical school in Illinois, and students don't really fare very much better there than they do at Boston University. But Ben Franklin once said that the seal, when they were talking about the national seal, the seal should be a depiction of Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. And I'm always intrigued when some of my students think that this was actually Jesus' job, that Jesus is the one who did this. So what the quiz shows to me is that, students cannot name the 4 Gospels. The average is about 2 out of the 4. About 1 in 4 can name a Hindu scripture. A lot can name, in recent years, since 9/11, can name the Quran. About 8 or 9 out of 10 can name the Quran. George Bush refers in his first inaugural address to the Jericho Road. This was when he was trying to do compassionate conservatism. And he said, when we go down the Jericho Road, we see our neighbor across who's hurting, we will not pass that person. We will cross to the other side and we will help them. This is a reference to the Good Samaritan story, when the various religious leaders just pass on by, and Jesus notices that the Samaritan, who's supposed to be the sort of outcast ethnicity, crosses over and helps this person. But only, I think, only 3% of my students, 1 out of 30, knew that reference was to the Good Samaritan story, which to me is very interesting. Here's a president who's trying to communicate something biblical in arguably the most public speech a president makes, which is his inaugural address. But this is just it's not going here over the heads, it's going way up here over the heads of of Americans, only 12% of my students can name the first 5 books of the Bible. Only less than two-thirds know what the golden rule is. The 10 Commandments, they actually do better than I thought they would. They get almost 5 out of 10. The one they get very well, by the way, is no adultery. They remember that for some reason. The one they don't get is the Sabbath, which I think it's because there's not enough Jews to kind of bring that. Jews might know that, but Christians don't really do the Sabbath. So that kind of, they sort of forget that. So that's the one that's the least memorable. Understanding of Buddhism with the Four Noble Truths is very low. Catholics have a lot of difficulty naming the 7 sacraments. Obviously, 7 sacraments of Catholicism. Obviously, Protestants do. And then one that I find really troubling is the First Amendment and religion clauses. I ask, what are the 2 things that the First Amendment says about religion? And it's a very rare student who can actually name both. Only about a third, less than a third, can even name one. Can name the Free Exercise Clause or the Establishment Clause. And then just today, I had someone on my staff in the department, Brenda's not here, but she worked up these final grades for Catholics, atheists, Hindus, Buddhists and Sikhs, Jews, and Protestants, which I found really interesting. The thing you'll notice this is on a scale of, I'm not sure what the scale is. I think these are supposed to be doubled. I'm sorry. I'm pretty sure when it says 25 that the way the test was graded is you have to double it at the end. So everybody, the average here is flunking, by the way, even if you double it. I think it should be doubled. 25 really means a 50. They got half right. The Catholics got about half right last year, and then just slightly better. But notice who does best on this quiz. Catholics. Catholics first, Protestants second, Jews third, Hindus, Buddhists, and Sikhs fourth, and then atheists and agnostics last. So a little bit interesting because the stereotype of religious knowledge is that the evangelical Protestants and Protestants do better than Catholics on these sorts of things. It may be tilted toward Catholics in the sense that Catholics do tend to learn the 7 sacraments more than the Protestants do, and they also maybe tend to learn the 10 Commandments more. So there may be a little bias in the way that I did the quiz. But anyway, I decided to do this because this, for some reason, in a lot of the media that is swirling around my book, everybody's into this quiz. Everybody's republishing my quiz. I just put it in at the end, like right before the book was published. But everybody thinks this quiz is cool. I'm sure you do too. I'm sure you find it really fascinating. And I do though, in the sense that it is an interesting way to test. See how you do. See how can you pass this quiz? Okay, I just want to say a little bit about the book. I may read a little bit from one section, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. And I really just want to outline what the book tries to do and some of the arguments that the book makes. The central paradox that starts the book, that gives the book momentum at the beginning, is one of these paradoxes that I think once you hear it, it's intuitively obvious. And I'm not sure if that makes me smart or dumb for having noticed it, but it's not the kind of thing that is that surprising once you hear it. But it wasn't until I wrote this book the kind of thing that a lot of people were saying. And the paradox is this, that the United States is one of the most religious countries in the world, but Americans know next to nothing about religion, their own religions or the religions of others. That's really the starting point of the book. And I go through a fair amount of polling data, none of it my own, except for some references to these quizzes I gave my students, which isn't really scientific polling data. But there have been some polls done by the Gallup people and done by George Barna, who's an evangelical Protestant who does polling and is interested in religion. But the kinds of things that I found really mostly over the last 15 years, but some of the data even going back into the 60s, it was pretty consistent. And I'll just give you a few of these data points. Only half of American adults can name even one of the 4 Gospels. Most Americans cannot name the first book of the Bible. Only 1/3 know that Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. One often incorrect guess is Billy Graham must have delivered the Sermon on the Mount. A majority of Americans wrongly believe that the Bible says that Jesus was born in Jerusalem. Now, that was a little tricky because it was a question that was, I think it was maybe a yes-no question or something like that. When asked whether the New Testament book of Acts is in the Old Testament, 1/4 of Americans say yes. More than a third say that they don't know. So if you add up the third that doesn't know and the quarter that gets it wrong, it's a very thin, it's actually less than a majority who actually know the correct answer. Most Americans don't know that Jonah is a book in the Bible, and this is one of my favorite. 10% of Americans believe that Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. So this is just me aggregating this information, and it's really quite astonishing once you start looking at it, how poorly Americans do on this sort of thing. So I started thinking about this issue, and both historically, because I'm a historian, how did this happen? Because it seems strange, it seems counterintuitive. You'd think Americans are so religious that they would know a lot about religion, at least about their own religion. And I remembered back to a sociologist of religion, Danielle Hervieux-Léger, who's written a book called Religion as a Chain of Memory. And it's a really interesting argument about how Europe became secularized. And the argument that she makes is that it becomes secularized not because people become atheists, like all these atheism books now that are out there that I'm competing with now, and they're like the religion lists, I'm competing with the atheist books. Letter to a Christian Nation, or Richard Dawkins's books, or Professor Dennett's books. These books speak of a kind of European style of atheism that is about rejecting certain claims. And what Léger says is that secularism in Europe is actually not about rejecting certain claims. It's actually about forgetfulness, which to me was really interesting. In other words, Europe became secular not because Europeans all decided the religion proposition was wrong, but because they got a kind of amnesia about what was going on. And so I'm going to read a little section that has to do with that, just a few paragraphs, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I see this as a problem, why this isn't just kind of a concern that a religious studies professor would have, why this is a concern that all of you should have, and we as Americans, those of us who are, should have. So this is a section called Religion as a Chain of Memory, and it starts, "In The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat," a 1987 book by the neurologist Oliver Sacks. Sacks wrote about patients with Korsakoff syndrome, a neurological illness characterized by profound amnesia. Not knowing in any given moment what they are doing or why, these patients wander around in a state of profound disorientation. In losing their memory, they have lost themselves. Societies suffer from similar syndromes. The French sociologist Danielle Hervieux-Léger has written eloquently about the loss of faith in Europe as a sort of amnesia. The rise of secularism in Europe, she contends, is rooted not so much in doubt as in forgetting. Religion is a chain of memory, she argues, and Europeans have broken the chain. Faith is more robust in the United States, but Americans are forgetters too. Catholics have forgotten the words of the Baltimore Catechism their parents and grandparents once knew by heart. Protestants have forgotten the key plot points in the Exodus story, which beckoned New England's colonists to a new world Zion. Methodists have forgotten what distinguishes them from Baptists, and whatever Americans once knew about Islam and Asian religions, well, they have forgotten most of that too. Many of the institutions that once forged the chain of memory that is religion are now some of its weakest links. Because of grave misunderstandings about the First Amendment and the separation of church and state, the subject of religion is taboo in many public schools. Moreover, churches, synagogues, and other religious congregations, which once inculcated the fourth R, religion, effectively, though doubtless in their own manner, are now doing so ineffectively or not at all. Basic religious literacy is lacking even in seminaries, where many ministers in the making are unable to describe the distinguishing marks of the denominations they are training to serve. I think I'll stop right there. But this is sort of was a starting point for me in my historical thinking to think about the decline of religious literacy not as a move toward atheism, because it wasn't that. It was quite the opposite. The development of religious literacy happened as the country became more religious rather than less religious. And so it was really helpful to me to start thinking about it in terms of broken links in the chain of memory. And I started asking about, well, what are the links in the chain? And for me, they were the household, which used to teach religion to kids, and the schools, which used to teach religion to kids, and what else? Colleges and universities and various institutions like that I was interested in looking at and talk about in the historical part of the book. But to go back to the problem of religious literacy and the sort of the so what question, well, why should we care? It's clear why you should care if you're Jewish and you want to raise your kids Jewish and you realize your kids don't know anything about Judaism. This might be a problem. If you're an evangelical and you want to raise your kids evangelical and you realize your kids don't know anything about the Bible, this might be a problem. But I explicitly talk in the book toward the beginning about how that's not my issue. The issue for me is not the problems that Catholics have with Catholic illiteracy, or that Protestants have with biblical illiteracy, or that Jews have with Jewish illiteracy. The problem that I really focus on is civic. It's political. And the observation that I make is that we live in a time where our politics are becoming increasingly religious, in the sense that political actors now are able, both on the right and the left, to use religious reasons to justify the public policy positions that they take. It used to be in the United States that was problematic. But I think it's since Jimmy Carter, particularly since the late 1970s, American politicians, including American presidents, and most particularly in American presidential campaigns, have referred to religion as a way to demonstrate the sort of man of faith, or woman of faith, we might say now, element of a presidential candidate. And increasingly it's understood to be legitimate for people to invoke, say, the Bible or Christianity in making arguments about abortion, in making arguments about the environment, in making arguments about stem cell research, in making arguments about gay marriage. And this was perfected by the Republicans. And in the 2004 election, the Democrats said, hey, why should the Republicans get all the kudos from the God talk? We're going to do the God talk too. And as I'm sure many of you have noticed, Democrats are now getting good at the God talk. So we have politicians in both the left and the right, both the Republicans and the Democrats, who are increasingly using religious language and religious arguments to make their public policy points. And so if we as citizens who are voting for them, who are contesting with them, ideally, in the public space about various questions, are not able to engage on the religious questions, then we end up deferring either to the politicians making the claims or to the pundits and the talking heads on TV who are interpreting the claims that are being made by the politicians. And ideally, I would like for readers of my book and for citizens in the United States, when a politician says the Bible is opposed to gay marriage, I would like them to be able to say, where? Or, I've read the Bible on homosexuality. I don't think the Bible is opposed to gay marriage. Or, to the contrary, to say, well, I have read the Bible, and I think the Bible is opposed to gay marriage. And I agree with you. I think it's a really good biblical argument that you're making. Right now, what happens is you have people on the secular left who will say, this is an illegitimate use of argument in the public space, because we shouldn't be having religious arguments. And that's actually has been one response to my book, from sort of strict separation of church and state people. Say, why are you, Prothero, trying to get Americans to learn about religion so they can engage religion in the public space? We should be telling them to shut up when it comes to religion. And my response to that is that wishing doesn't make it so. You can say, let's assume for a second that I would love to have a public space that was totally bereft of religious reasons. I'm agnostic about that in the book. But let's assume that I were. The fact that I wish that isn't going to make the Democrats decide it's a bad strategy to talk about religion in this next presidential campaign. They already know it is a good thing, and they're going to do it, and so are the Republicans, because it's so successful. So the question is whether citizens are able to engage or not, whether they're able to participate in the democracy or not when it comes to these questions. And I would like to see them to do it, and I would like to see them call politicians to task when they make religious claims. If the public knows enough about religion to call them to task, then that would be, to me, more participatory, better democratic situation. So that's that's the first answer to the so what question. We need to know something about religion, particularly about Christianity and the Bible, in order to engage American politicians about American public policy questions. That's the first part. The second part has to do with abroad rather than home. It has to do with international affairs. And to me, this is much more troubling. This is where I get frightened when I realize that citizens and politicians don't know anything about religion. And this has to do now less with Christianity and with the Bible, and more with particularly Islam, but then also in other religions. If we're looking at Sri Lanka, we might want to know something about Buddhism and Hinduism. If we're looking at Kashmir, we might want to know something about Hinduism and Islam. If we're looking at the Middle East, we might want to know something about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But it's clear to me that politicians don't know much about any of these religions, and so they're flying blind when they're acting in the international affairs space without knowing what are the deepest held beliefs, commitments, and sensibilities of people in these countries where where Americans are trying to, affect some transformations or some kinds of changes. And so one of the, really scary examples for me is this Democratic congressman from Texas, Sylvester Reyes, who was asked a few weeks ago about Al-Qaeda. Is Al-Qaeda a Sunni or a Shiite group? And he said, Sunni or Shiite? Shiite. He figured he had a 50% chance. He knew he didn't know, but he figured he had a 50% chance, and lucky for us, he got it wrong, so we knew that he didn't know. And Al-Qaeda is a Sunni group. Now, that's not the kind of thing that necessarily all of you would know. I mean, some of you, I hope, do. But this is a gentleman who now runs the House Intelligence Committee. This is not the kind of person who's running the, the highway, the Department of Transportation or something. This is somebody who's charged with, counterterrorism questions, and with dealing with national security. And if you don't know that Al-Qaeda is a Sunni group, then you don't understand why they want to kill Shiites, and you don't understand why they're willing to violate the centuries-old Muslim prohibition against killing other Muslims, which they did violate in 9/11 when they killed all sorts of Muslims in those various buildings across the country. And you don't understand how it is that the martyrdom strategy moves from the Shiite community, which is where it begins, into the Sunni community, which is really important and really scary, because the majority Sunni community in Islam has always been opposed to this sort of thing until literally like the last decade. So not to know that, to me, is really frightening. Really frightening. Much more frightening than Howard Dean, trying to show in that election that he was religious too, and then the reporter rightly says, "Good, I'm glad to know you're so religious. Like, prove me you know something. Like, what's your favorite New Testament book?" Well, I love the Book of Job. So this is the international question to me. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State under President Clinton, she came out with a book recently, The Mighty and the Almighty, and she talked in that book about how she, as Secretary of State, had access to dozens of economic and political experts when it came to working on foreign affairs. And she had one informal religion person that she could talk to, who kind of covered all the religions and sort of was there on, I don't know what, like, a phone call on Friday afternoon between 1 and 1:30, if she happened to catch this person. She also talks in the book about how we have no requirement for ambassadors in this country beyond giving lavish political contributions to whomever wins the White House. That seems to be the main requirement for being an ambassador. There's no requirement that the ambassador to India, for example, knows anything about Hinduism or anything about Islam. That isn't a matter of American policy. There's no requirement that the ambassador to Dubai knows something about Islam. I find that really frightening and scary and crazy. In the recent study on the Iraq Study Group, it was discovered that there are only 6 people out of the 1,000 in the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad who speak Arabic fluently. 6 people out of 1,000. That's 6 points if you're like into the stock market. That's less than 1%. And the question I have is, how many of them have taken one college course in Islam? I will bet you it's lower than 6. I'm happy to stand corrected, but I don't know. So I find this frightening that we're trying to conduct international affairs. We're trying to conduct a so-called war on terrorism. We are conducting a hot war in Iraq, in a country where we don't speak the language, we don't understand the culture, and we're just learning now that Sunnis and Shiites are two different divisions inside Islam, and they don't particularly like one another. And all of a sudden we're surprised. Apparently when we started the war, we weren't aware that this might be a problem. And like I say, this is the kind of thing that actually doesn't require someone with a PhD in Islamic studies. It requires someone with basic religious literacy to ask a question like, what's going to happen with the Sunnis and the Shiites in Iraq when we go in and upset this, long-standing equilibrium that's been there in this country, rightly or wrongly. So that's the argument about why this isn't just a preoccupation of a religious studies professor who's trying to give a higher profile to his fairly arcane academic subject. The next question for me is what to do. What should we do about this? And of course the answer is read my book, right? That's always the answer. Read my book, take the quiz, read the dictionary in the back. The dictionary, by the way, one way that I constructed it, which I think is a little bit novel, is I tried to think, the question for me was, what terms do you need to know to understand American politics? So it wasn't, what do you need to know stuff about the world's religions? It was, what stuff about the world's religions do you need to know to follow American politics? So part of that for me was going through the congressional record and looking at what kind of things came up in debates on the floors of the House and the Senate, what kind of references were made to the Bible or to other scriptures, if any. And so I sort of focused on that in terms of honing my list down. And then when I talk about the terms, I'll define a given term, like I'll tell the story of the Good Samaritan, for example. But then I'll refer to Hillary Clinton's use of the Good Samaritan story in arguing against the immigration legislation that was proposed last year by the Republicans, where she said that to pass this legislation and to ask Americans to turn in these immigrants coming over the border from Mexico when they're walking through their town or knocking on their door asking for food, and then you're supposed to turn them into the government as that legislation would have it. She said that would violate the spirit of the Good Samaritan story. And to me, that's actually, what an interesting, is that true? I'm not sure it is, by the way. But it might be. It's sort of plausible on the face of it, but maybe not. Because, if somebody escapes from prison and they have an Uzi and they're wandering through your backyard and they ask you for food, I'm not sure it violates the Good Samaritan story to call the cops or put them in a trap in your basement. I don't know. But that's the kind of discussion I would like to be able to have as a public. Wouldn't it be cool if when Hillary Clinton said that, it didn't end the conversation, and a reporter could say, "You know what? I've read that story too. I'm not really. Where do you see that in this legislation? Is it on page 527 of the bill? And then we could have a debate about that. So anyway, in the dictionary, I try to focus on the explicit political usages of particular terms, stories, etc., or where they might come up in American politics or in international affairs. So that's the one. That's the obvious answer from a book signing at a bookstore. Read my book. That's the answer. But the other one that I argue for in the book is for education. That we need the public schools to take up this challenge, this civic challenge of religious illiteracy. And the argument I make is that we should have a world religion class and a Bible class for all public school students. And those might be taken in the middle school grades. I think a world religions course is pretty appropriate for 8th graders, 9th graders. And the Bible course is more appropriate for, say, juniors and seniors in high school. And this proposal has gotten a lot of interest lately in the media. That I don't know if you've seen Time Magazine had a cover story this week picking up on this proposal for a Bible course in the public schools. And one of the arguments that's made pretty often, particularly about the Bible course in the public schools, is that somehow it's unconstitutional. There's really two arguments that are made. One is that it's unconstitutional, and the other argument is that it will somehow create religious war. We're going to all of a sudden have guerrilla warfare in towns and cities where we have Bible courses. That the Protestants and the Catholics and the Jews are going to be on the outskirts of the public school, and some of them are going to have, shotguns, and some of them are going to have hand grenades, and they're going to be screaming, we want our Bible, or not that Bible story, or something like that. And this is going to create chaos in the streets, and we're going to have to bring out the National Guard. That's a fair description of my critics' position on this. And so I just want to say a couple things about both of those. And on the constitutional question, I must confess, my only response to this argument is frustration, because all you need to do is be able to read the Supreme Court cases on this, or if you have 2 ears right now, or even one good ear, and you listen to what I'm about to read to you, you'll realize that there's absolutely no constitutional question here. And I'll just read my discussion here in the book. It's pretty quick. It refers to 3 or 4 court cases. In McCollum v. Board of Education, 1948, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson voted with a majority to outlaw Sunday school-style religious instruction, what he called the teaching of creed and catechism and ceremonial, in public schools. But he worried about leaving public education in shreds, those are his terms, if all references to God were ruled out of bounds in the classroom. And I quote him, "Music without sacred music, architecture minus the cathedral, or painting without the scriptural themes would be eccentric and incomplete, even from a secular point of view," he writes. And then he continues, "Certainly a course in English literature that omitted the Bible and other powerful uses of our mother tongue for religious ends would be pretty barren. And I should suppose it is a proper, if not an indispensable part of preparation for worldly life to know the roles that religion and religions have played in the tragic story of mankind." And that's the end of the quote. Admitting that it can be difficult to determine precisely when teaching tips over into preaching, and this is, of course, an essential ingredient of my argument and any argument for the teaching about religion in the public schools. It cannot be preaching of any particular religion, or even of religion in general. It has to be academic, non-devotional teaching. Admitting that this can be difficult, Jackson insisted nonetheless on keeping the study of religion in the public schools. The fact is, he concluded, that for good or for ill, nearly everything in our culture worth transmitting, everything which gives meaning to life, is saturated with religious influences. In Abingdon v. Shemp, 1963 case, Supreme Court, which outlawed devotional Bible reading in the public schools, the Supreme Court again gave a constitutional seal of approval to the academic study of religion. Speaking for the majority, Justice Thomas Clark wrote, "It might well be said that one's education is not complete without a study of comparative religion or the history of religion and its relationship to the advancement of civilization. It certainly may be said that the Bible is worthy of study for its literary and historic qualities. Nothing we have said here indicates that such study of the Bible or of religion, when presented objectively as a part of a secular program of education, may not be effected consistent with the First Amendment." Justice William Brennan, in a concurring opinion in the same case, 1963, echoed Clark. He writes, "The holding of the court today plainly does not foreclose teaching about the Holy Scriptures or about the differences between religious sects in classes in literature or history. Indeed, whether or not the Bible is involved, it would be impossible to teach meaningfully many subjects in the social sciences or the humanities without some mention of religion." And then I go on and I quote from 2 more cases, 1980 and 1987. I won't bore you with those. But the point is that you know how they say, like, you can get a text to say anything, You can't with these Supreme Court cases. These Supreme Court cases are so clear. They keep repeating over and over again. You can't do prayer and devotional Bible reading in the public schools. But that does not mean that you can't teach about religion. And not just do we give our constitutional stamp of approval to such teaching. We think it's essential to have such teaching. And so do I. So there's no constitutional issue here. The practical issue about this is going to foment dissension, and we're going to have, it'll be the Middle Ages again, religious warfare, I think is equally silly, though understandable in some way. The reason I think it's silly is, for one, we already have these courses in a lot of places in the country. And there's no evidence, empirical, historical, or otherwise, that school districts that are now teaching Bible as literature courses, which is about 1 in every 12, which is scandalously low, but nonetheless is 8%. These are not school districts where, we're having these huge battles. These are school districts where people of goodwill have figured out a way to make this work, given clear challenges, like whose Bible are we going to read, and are people going to try to convert people to Jesus in southern towns where there's a huge preponderance of born-again Christians, et cetera, et cetera. These are challenges that need to be met and I think can be overcome. Similarly, we've had world religions classes. There was a study done of a school district in Modesto, California, that has instituted a mandatory requirement for all ninth graders in its school district to take a world religions course. This is a district that has a very large population. It's in Orange County, of evangelical Christians that go to these megachurches. It also has a large population of Hindus and Buddhists, both, and some of a population of Muslims. And they've figured out a way to do this course. They have an opt-out provision where kids or parents who object to the course aren't required to take it. Otherwise, everybody is. And only about 2 or 3 kids each year are opting out of this course. And there's no trouble whatsoever in terms of, the school district or the town erupting into some huge violence or even conflict about what's going on in these courses. So what to do, courses in the public schools, and then I also argue in the book that colleges should have a requirement of a religious studies course. And this would help my employment situation, to be sure that we had enough faculty in my department. But seriously, I think it is scandalous, to use that word again, for a university, BU or otherwise, to provide a diploma to people, which I think on the face of it says, this is an educated person. I do think that's what a BA says. This is an educated person. And then to have this educated person go out into the world and flunk my really, really easy religious literacy test. I think students who graduate from BU should be able to pass my religious literacy test. And I think the way to assure that is to assure that they take at least one course. Have students at BU and at other institutions take one course. So let me conclude, and then we have some questions to say that people have asked me, am I hopeful about these sorts of things happening? And I have to say, I actually am hopeful. I'm actually hopeful. I'm hopeful because I think that a lot of discussion today in American politics and in American religion is dominated by 2 groups. It's dominated by the people on the religious right who want to sort of ram religion down our throats, and it's dominated by people on the secular left who want to get religion totally out of the public space and divorce politics from religion in a way that I don't think the founders ever of the country ever contemplated. And these are the people who give us what is known as the culture wars, where they're going to get into these big battles over, say, a Bible course in the public school. And I just don't actually think that most Americans are in either of those camps. I think those 2 camps seem large because when it comes time for people to get on Meet the Press or for people to, get on, Hardball and talk about these questions, that they naturally call in Jerry Falwell, who, by the way, has a negative rating among evangelicals in the United States. Most evangelicals think Jerry Falwell is a nut. But they'll put on Jerry Falwell, and he'll get to represent the evangelicals. And then they'll put on some crazy person on the secular left who's an atheist and who thinks that any politician who ever says the word God should be, impeached. And then those are the 2 people who will have this supposedly intelligent conversation. And I think that's ridiculous. And I think that most Americans are in the middle on these questions. And I think most Americans, and in fact there's polling data to indicate this, most Americans want courses like the kinds that I'm proposing to be taught in the public schools. And I think that the only alternative really is ignorance. It's another generation of Americans who can't name the 4 Gospels, who don't know the first book of the Bible, and who don't know the difference between Sunnis and Shiites, which for those of you who saw the Jon Stewart show the other night, by the way, Jon Stewart very helpfully clarified the difference between Sunnis and Shiites. But anyway, I will conclude on that note, and we have time for questions, or comments or criticisms. So I will take comments or criticisms or questions. Yes, sir.
I really have three thoughts, and I'll try to make them very short.
How about if you do one thought, and then we'll come back to your other ones later.
Okay, they're all interrelated.
Okay.
And the one has to do with the fact that you can't teach literature and be religiously illiterate. Certainly not Western literature, any literature. And then the other thing is that I'm a scientist, and scientific illiteracy troubles me greatly. Almost everyone has a cell phone, and probably less than 8% of them can tell you how it works. And I think that, so I'm saying it's not just what you're talking about, but there's a broader issue. And then the final point is that you have to generalize this outside of the United States. This is not just a problem in the United States. And it's particularly a problem, for instance, at Boston University, we have many international students. They come here, many of them, knowing nothing about the Christian tradition, or maybe the Jewish tradition, or whatever. And there's a concern there that we should direct them in channels so they can become sufficiently literate in religion that they'll be able to hold their own and understand what's going on in this culture.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I totally agree on the first point in terms of that understanding of the Bible is critical to understanding, as the justice pointed out, actually in the 1948 case, to understanding not only American literature but also even the history of Western music, and indeed American politics. You know, Lincoln's famous House Divided speech is an extended commentary on one passage from the Gospel of Luke, where he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." This is where Lincoln starts his reflections in that very, very famous speech. Same with Martin Luther King. So music, literature, politics, I totally agree. I think scientific illiteracy is a huge problem, and this is an argument some people have used against my proposal. It seems to me a silly form of an argument, in the sense of, if you say people are really uneducated about, and then somebody responds, "Yeah, but they're really uneducated about too," right? And then the thought is like, well, what's the thought? Okay, we either shouldn't care about, we're uneducated about anything, or is it that, you know, one should have priority over the other? And the argument for me about the priority of religious illiteracy is that, you know, I think the argument can be made that what got us into Iraq was not the lies of our president, but the religious ignorance of our president. And by that I mean his administration. I mean, I think that there's a lot of discussion about we were lied our way in. But, you know, to what extent were we, did we get in because we didn't get it? You know, because we had ideologues who didn't understand the practical realities of the way Islam works on the ground in, say, Iraq. Or to take, you know, a more banal example, you know, how many Americans knew what your average Muslim thinks about having American troops in Saudi Arabia? You know, how many Americans knew that? How many Americans in the administration knew that? Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have put troops there, but I'm saying when we decided to, we should have known that we're going to annoy 95% of the Muslim world by doing that. But did we know that? Did we know that that was considered a violation of their sacred, you know, space? If we hadn't, I mean, that is what made Osama bin Laden angry. You can read The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright. He's very good on this point. And so that's the sort of thing that, to me, it isn't, you know, scientific illiteracy is problematic too, and I don't want to downplay that. But religion is a really powerful form of culture. And religion, you know, as I say in the book, you know, religion flies planes into buildings. You know, religion makes the civil rights movement happen. It's a very powerful form of culture, and not to understand it is dangerous. And then the last point that you made, I forget what it was.
That the students come here.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Right. It was a comparative question, and I think that that the one reason why religious illiteracy matters, particularly in the United States, is because religious reasons are not out of order in the public space. You know, Per comes from our Scandinavian countries. You know, I mean, do presidents in Sweden and Norway, you know, get up and say, you know, I'm a good Christian, you know, vote for me because I know the Bible? This is not something that a politician would be. That would be kind of creepy for a politician to do that in most places in Europe. It's just not the way Europe operates, and so religious reasons are not particularly favored there. And so the civic argument I make for why we need religious literacy doesn't work there. Now, the international argument does, because if you live in Sweden, or if you live in Denmark, or if you live in England, it's important for you to know something about the world's religions in order to be able to follow and conduct foreign policy in your country. So that part of the argument is important. But I agree. I think that at a place like Boston University, you know, one thing we should be doing is educating whomever comes through here on these sorts of important matters, whether they come from the United States or elsewhere. Matt?
In terms of religious issues in American politics, do you have any ideas as to why maybe invoking religious thought has become more and more accepted in America? as maybe American religious literacy has declined or remains at a low
Yeah, I
level?
think it's more accepted. It's a good question. I think it's more accepted for one very simple reason, because it works. Because that's the way politics is. Why are the Democrats running after each other, trying to talk about religion? Because they got trounced in the 2004 election because they got beat on the religion question. That's at least part of what they think. Now, whether that's true or not, that's the perception. Why are the Republicans? When I was your age, how old are you, Matt? All right. When I was your age, I was in college, and I watched Ronald Reagan get elected in 1980. And I was an idiot because I sat around with my friends and I thought Ronald Reagan was going to lose. And what did he lose, like 2 states or something? I mean, I was an idiot because I didn't get it. I didn't understand what was happening in the country in terms of the shift from the liberal ethos that I was in as a college student and the conservative ethos that was overtaking the country, in great measure because of the power of the evangelical base that the Republicans were beginning to cultivate in the late 70s and early 80s. They were very, very effective at that. It was a really great political strategy. And so when a political strategy works, other people use it. It draws in imitators. So that's my answer. I think it works, sure.
You were talking about religion as one of the aspects of culture, and I was curious in these international affairs in particular where our problem is really cultural literacy as opposed to particularly religious literacy. Because just to speak about what I know, in Israel there's a very macho culture. So it's a Jewish country, but the macho culture doesn't come from the Judaism. It comes from the Israeli political history. And so when you're trying to deal in Middle Eastern relations, you're dealing with Jewish countries and Muslim countries, but the primary issues, I think, are not necessarily religious, but about the cultures that grew up kind of around those religions. And a lot of Muslims will tell you that these suicide bombings are not what Islam teaches, but something that grew up in Islam because of a political or cultural situation.
Right. Okay, so the question has to do with to what extent do Americans really need cultural literacy rather than religious literacy, because what really drives politics is really more, quote-unquote, more cultural than religious. And I guess, first of all, I would disagree with the premise, A, that Israeli culture is macho for a totally non-religious reason, because I've read the Hebrew Bible. It's a patriarchal text. The people I quoted at the beginning or talked about at the beginning, they're not women. The stories are all about men. And this is where Christianity gets its patriarchy, from Judaism. So the idea that the machismo of Israeli culture has nothing to do with religion seems to me preposterous. Almost as preposterous, though not quite, as the notion that Islam has nothing to do with suicide bombing. I find that to be scandalous to the point of criminal, because it's not true. Because Islam does have something to do with that. It reminds me of, I used to teach my students, I don't know if I tell this story in the book, but I used to teach my students in the South, at Georgia State. I would teach them Nazi theology. I would have them read Nazi theology. Some of it very smart, by the way, by these good Lutheran German theologians writing about the Jews. And it's really, really frightening stuff to read now. It was written, before the Holocaust. And they would always say just what you said. Oh, that's not Christianity. Christians didn't. That's not Christian. And I just find that criminal, because the part of it that's not criminal, that's ethical, admirably ethical, is to say, Christianity shouldn't kill Jews, shouldn't hate Jews, right? Muslims shouldn't, for Muslim reasons, fly into buildings and kill other Muslims and Christians and atheists, right? That's an admirable ethical position. But it's scary to think that there's this simple way to absolve your faith, or any faith, from historical responsibility. I would want Muslims to say after 9/11, what is it in my faith that would cause people to read it in this way? And of course, there's a long answer to that, right? And similarly, what is it in my faith that would cause people to kill Jews in the Holocaust? Because there's a long answer to that. So I agree that we need to know about other cultures, and I agree that cultural illiteracy is also a problem. But I do think that I think it's really hard to separate out, especially outside of Europe, which is fairly secular, It's really hard to separate the cultural components and the religious components. Yes, you had a question.
I like the idea of studying world religions, but I wonder what you mean by studying the Bible. What version of the Bible do you mean?
Oh, my version of the Bible, of course. How could it be? How could it be otherwise? No. Well, that's what got the big Bible wars of the 19th century, which I write about in the book, because the only two groups who had enough power to contest this were Catholics and Protestants, and the Catholics insisted on the Catholic Bible, and the Protestants insisted on the Protestant Bible, and finally they just decided we shouldn't teach the Bible at all because we can't agree which Bible to teach. And so one of the historical arguments of the book is that it wasn't secularists. This is one of the religious right arguments that's made about this. It was secularists who ran religion out of the public schools. It's not true. It was religious people. It was religious people who couldn't decide, who all wanted their own religion in the public school, and they couldn't decide, and finally they said, well, forget it, then we're not going to have any religion at all in the public school. I think we should have multiple translations of the Bible. I'm not at all opposed to having people bring in Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, whatever versions of the Bible, Muslim, if they want to, Mormon, versions of the Bible. There isn't a Muslim version of the Bible, so that's ill-posed. But anyway, you get my idea. And then they can talk about the different translations. So some of the curriculum for this, either propose students bring in their own Bibles, or they have translations of the Bible that are not canonical for any of the traditions. That's another way around it. One of the really interesting ways around this in the mid-19th century, around the problem of which Bible you were going to use, was there were some people who put together these readers. They put together these doggerel poems of like the Lord's Prayer, which wasn't the Catholic version or the Protestant version. It was this sort of silly limerick-style version of the Lord's Prayer. And they did the same with the Ten Commandments. So they got around that, whose version of it is this? Well, isn't anybody's. It's sort of a silly limerick writing poet's version. So that's another way to go. Yeah.
I taught the Bible at a Catholic high school here in Boston, but over half my students were evangelical. And because I was at a Catholic school, I was obligated and had the freedom to teach historical, critical study of the Bible. But this was a real barrier for me with the evangelical students. Right. You mentioned the fear of preaching when you teach the Bible, say, but what about the sensitivity to the nuances between different worldviews? I mean, it could be scandalous for some students to suggest that the Bible is written by humans alone, or even inspired by God, but with human bias.
Right. Right. So the question is, how do you, as a teacher, deal with the fact that there are some people, and this isn't just true of the Bible. If you're going to teach about the Quran, you're going to teach about the Upanishads, you could be in a classroom that had Muslims or Hindus who revered the text as sacred scripture. And if you start treating it like just an ordinary human text, then you run up against their sensibilities, right? And you also run up against the First Amendment, because if you start making a theological claim about those texts, you start to move from teaching into preaching, and it's very tricky to know how to do that. I guess I would agree with the Supreme Court Justice who says this is tricky. I mean, I will agree with that. I think, as you know, because you did it, that this is tricky. I'm not sure that we need to do a lot of historical critical teaching about the Bible. If you take other texts, I think we should in college. I think it runs into problems in high school. I think avoiding it runs into problems too. I think though avoiding it is the better course of action. And the argument I make about this has to do with other texts. When we read Melville, for example, and we read Moby Dick, do we do like the different, versions of that he wrote? Do we go in and look and say, well, this is what he did, and then he edited this, and then he added this because he heard this sermon, or he got sick at a certain point in his life, and so he threw in some discussion of scurvy, In other words, we don't. We read, I think we would have a discussion of, this is the period of American history, it's the rise of the industrial age, it's the time of the transcendentalists, right? We might do that. But we wouldn't do, there's the Q source that, is used by, Luke and is also used by Matthew, and they draw on Mark. That's kind of a sort of an egg-headed, foggy kind of preoccupation. that these New Testament scholars have so they can keep their jobs, you know? None of my colleagues are here who do this. I find some of that kind of odd, you know? And I'm not sure that high schoolers really need to learn that. The other question is how much there is to learn there, you know, in terms of how much of it is based, a lot of that stuff is really based on some very odd assumptions about things, you know, which are not necessarily... Now look, the fact that one of the 5 books of Moses describes the death of Moses is on its face kind of problematic, right? So a high school kid's going to ask about that, not even a smart one, just an awake one who's not sleeping. And I think at that point a teacher owes something to say, well, you know what, there is a debate about whether this person wrote this, and obviously a dead person didn't write about his own death, and so he couldn't have written this sentence. And I think that's probably okay. You know, but I'm not sure we need to spend half the course or a huge part of the course on the various source hypotheses about how this goes. How are we doing? One more. Yes.
So I worry about how you actually arrive at a secular curriculum that's going to be balanced in the sense that you want and that your Supreme Court sources said. But I do wonder also whether instead of thinking only about a course, just look whether who's looking very seriously at how religion enters into the general coursework in the middle and high schools. For example, I went to public schools in the 50s and 60s, so we learned our religion through, first of all, prayer of the public schools, where we got to hear what other people were doing. We learned it through our history courses. We learned it through our literature courses. We got it through geography. And that's all fallen apart, in part because of who controls the textbook industry as well. But I just wonder whether you thought about sort of the mainstreaming.
Right. Right. Well, of course, one argument for how to do this is simply to mainstream it. And you need more on the world religions in the social studies curriculum in the 8th grade, and you need more on the Bible in the English literature and the American literature and the world literature courses that kids take. And I'm all in favor of that. But I do think that having courses dedicated to these subjects underscores their civic importance, and that's part of what I'm trying to do and why I'm arguing for this. I will say that there is a discussion in the book about textbooks and how textbooks have moved away from religion in recent years because they're scared of it. And textbook publishers want to sell textbooks. And one way to sell textbooks is to not be ruled out of certain school districts for being too controversial. So they really do try to avoid, and have a whole discussion about how the topic of religion is scandalously avoided in world history and American history textbooks. And some of the real silly examples are discussions of Thanksgiving, where the pilgrims are giving thanks, and the question is, to whom? And then the textbook writers will say stuff like, to the Indians, you know, which isn't what happened. They were giving thanks to God because they believed in God, and they believed God had brought them over, and they were grateful that only half of them had died that year. And so that's a problem, and that I would like to see addressed. And I would hope that the proposals I have for these courses that are dedicated to the Bible and to the world's religions would not obviate the necessity and the importance of including discussions of religion in a lot of other disciplines in high school. Part of this can be done, by the way, I really do believe, by just educating teachers, administrators, and school boards about what the Supreme Court really said, that there's nothing unconstitutional about talking about religion in the public schools. There's absolutely nothing unconstitutional about it. And a lot of people have responded to these cases by just trying to avoid it. And in fact, there's an argument that avoiding it actually is unconstitutional in itself, because it's a sort of theological assumption that religion doesn't matter, which encodes a kind of secularism that maybe is inappropriate for the public schools. So anyway, that's not my position. I think it's an interesting argument. But I'd like to see these studies, expanded beyond these particular courses. Jean says our time is up, but I'm going to stay here and I'm going to sign some books if people want me to. I'm sure my signed copy will be extremely valuable in the future. And also I'm happy to field other questions while I'm up here. So thank you all for coming very much.